Welcome everyone. Welcome to the ChinaMed Connectivity and Security series. I'm Enrico Fardella. I'm a professor at Peking University, director of the Center for Mediterranean Area Studies, and director of the ChinaMed Research Project. I am sitting virtually next to my co-host of this project, Professor Sela, the head of the Department for East Asian Studies at Tel Aviv University, Professor Friedman, the head of research of Moshe Dayan Center for Middle East and North African Studies, and Andrea Ghiselli, that is a researcher at Fudan University and the head of research of the ChinaMed project. Today, we would like to look in our webinar at Southern European countries' local perspective on China's role in the region. And I'm very honored and privileged to do so with three renowned and vibrant experts. We have Lucrezia Poggetti, analyst at Mercator Institute for China Studies, Philippe, research fellow at Harvard Kennedy School, and Plamen Tonchev, head of Asia unit at the Athens-based Institute of International Economic Relations. Thank you all for accepting our invitation today, and welcome to the China in the Mid-Med series. So, if you don't mind, I would like to begin with an overview of the evolution of Southern European countries' approach to China in the last year. If you could point out the main changes that occurred in Italy, France, and Greece' approach to China as a result of internal dynamics, the response to US-China growing antagonism, and the COVID crisis would be great. We can begin with Lucrezia and then Philippe and Dulcis in Fundo Plamen. Lucrezia, the floor is yours.
Thanks, Enrico, and thank you so much for having me. It's a pleasure to connect with all of you. There's quite a lot to unpack when it comes to Italy-China relations, so I'll try to give a brief overview of what I saw as the main changes, as you said, Enrico, in Italian approaches to China over the past year or so, but also looking at the response to growing Sino-US antagonism, and lastly, to the COVID-19 crisis. Looking first at the internal dynamics, I actually would like to go back even further during the Gentiloni government, which is, as many of you will remember, the first time that Italy also attended the first Belt and Road Forum in May 2017, signaling already an interest in cooperating with China along the Belt and Road Initiative. Very briefly, I would like to summarize that approach that the Italian government back then was following as one that was focused, yes, on trying and seeking closer economic cooperation with China, while at the same time staying very close to the European partners. So at the same time as Italy was participating in the Belt and Road Forum, the Italian, French, and German government together were also launching a discussion with the European Commission to set up the foreign investment screening framework that was adopted last year and that will become fully operative in October this year. But then we have a radical change last year with the first Conte government, and especially with the first coalition of the League and the Five-Star Movement, which is the period that everyone remembers as Italy pursuing a China-friendly policy towards China and deciding to join the Belt and Road Initiative as the first G7 member to do so. Trying again here to summarize in broad strokes the main approach there, I think the approach of the Italian government then was based on what was then proved to be a false assumption that close political relations with China would translate into economic opportunities. So specifically, two members of that coalition, Luigi Di Maio, who was then Minister for Economic Development, and then Undersecretary in his ministry, Michele Geraci of the League, they created a China task force specifically with the goal of joining BRI, attracting more investment on the Made in China 2025, and trying especially to reduce the trade deficit between Italy and China, which in fact ended up widening further after Italy joined the Belt and Road Initiative. And then we have a third phase, which was actually launched, I think, by the discussions triggered with the Belt and Road MOU. And I think we are still in that third phase. And I summarize that as Italy starting to discuss China, not just purely as an economic player, but increasingly also as a geopolitical actor whose actions have implications for security, politics, and values. Two key examples that I'd like to mention. One is the whole debate on 5G. Italy just last year in November adopted a new cybersecurity framework, the so-called perimeter, which is going to have implications for the actors that are involved in the rollout of next generation 5G networks. And another example in December 2019 is the unanimous adoption of a resolution on Hong Kong following the developments from last summer, which obviously are continuing right now with the national security law. So that's to say that increasingly strategic and values-related issues are making it into the conversation about China in Italy. Initially, that's a discussion that is mostly actually led by the far right, with political parties like the League and Brothers of Italy, but increasingly the central left, including the Five Star Movement's coalition partner, the Democratic Party, taking a stance on a lot of these issues. Now, let me now focus briefly on growing Sino-US antagonism and how the Italian approach has been shifting to factoring those dynamics into the conversation about China. One general point I'd like to mention is the fact that the United States have been a catalyst for the Italian debate on China. Italy didn't really have a debate, not even on China and not even on the Belt and Road MOU back in 2019, despite the fact that plans to sign the MOU had already been announced in late 2018. And it was actually after the White House and especially the National Security Council expressed their criticism for the MOU that the Italian parliament decided to have a conversation about what the Italian government was about to join by formally endorsing BRI. Specifically, when it comes to issue areas, I think the main areas of concerns for the United States in particular when it comes to Italian-China policy have been three: space cooperation, 5G, and ports. Space cooperation is probably the areas that saw the most significant change for Italy to adapt to growing Sino-US tensions. When Italy signed the BRI MOU in March, just a couple of days later, the Italian government also joined a cooperation, basically signed another memorandum with China to do cooperation on space. But then only a few months later, the Italian government also decided to join Artemis, so another space collaboration project with the United States. And this was October 2019. And then right after, in November 2019, the then Minister of Education, Fiorentino, on a visit to China, basically scaled down space cooperation with China and decided effectively to withdraw Italy from that cooperation in space. On the other two issues of 5G, at least my reading would be that, in fact, the Italian debate on 5G and Huawei and ZTE's involvement has actually been quite independent from the United States. The discussions about the cybersecurity, national cybersecurity perimeter had actually already started before the tensions between the United States and China started to grow. So for sure, there have been a push from the United States to disentangle from China in that space as well. But I think the Italian government has pursued an approach to try and secure itself regardless of what the United States was asking for. And finally, on ports, that's also an interesting area where, in fact, there hasn't been much movement after the signature of the BRI MOU. The projects that are moving forward are the ones that had already been in place before Italy joined BRI. So we're talking about the Vado Ligure Gateway Terminal, built in collaboration with Costco. We're talking about China Communications Construction Company participation in Venice, and a memorandum with the same Chinese company and the Port of Trieste. But beyond that, there hasn't been much movement. So ports are certainly an area where the US has voiced concerns, but at the same time, there hasn't been much movement after the BRI MOU signature. And quickly, just two brief points that I want to make here. The fact that the Italian government obviously has substantial golden power legislation that allows the Italian government to scrutinize investment in strategic critical infrastructure like ports. At the same time, we do need to keep in mind the fact that that tool is a political instrument. So ultimately the decision despite being informed by the security communities and different ministries, is a political kind of decision. And secondly, I just want to emphasize the importance of not just framing this kind of issues as, you know, the US and China asking Italy to pick sides, because oftentimes they are led by genuine security concerns. If we think of space, everyone remembers the case of Galileo effectively contributing to Beidou navigation system. So, you know, it's also kinds of collaboration that have implication for dual use that needs to be kept in mind, and same for 5G. And finally, a few brief last points on the COVID-19 crisis and how that has changed the landscape when it comes to China policy in Italy. I will differentiate between politics and public perception. When it comes to politics, it looks like the Five-Star Movement, with its more China-friendly posture, has started to be a little more isolated. As I said before, both the left and the right are increasingly critical of this kind of approach. We've heard multiple times criticism from all parts of government in the ruling coalition and in the opposition about Foreign Minister Di Maio's openness to China and the role he played as an amplifier of China's external propaganda, so-called mass diplomacy, in the early stages of the epidemic in Italy. In terms of public perception, recent polls indicate that the Italian public is probably increasingly polarized in terms of views about China. On one hand, China is seen as a friend and as the main ally of Italy during the pandemic, which is remarkable considering that in fact only about 10% of the medical supplies that arrived from China to Italy during the pandemic were donations. Everything else was exports that was paid for by Italian agencies. But this could be indeed the result of external propaganda that gave the impression that everything coming from China was part of aid packages. At the same time, China is also increasingly seen as an untrustworthy, unreliable partner by some other parts of politics and society. So this is what I'm referring to as the polarization. And briefly, I'll conclude here because I'm conscious of time. Going forward, I think this is where we're left with this increased polarization and a debate that has become more sophisticated, including not just economic, but increasingly also security, values, and strategic considerations. And obviously beyond COVID-19, what we're all looking at right now is China's actions on Hong Kong, which is going to be another issue that European governments, and not just Italy, altogether have to discuss and think about really hard in terms of how we decide to approach China going forward. And I will leave it at that.
Thank you very much, Lucrezia. Excellent, very interesting. And now, Philippe, would you like to say something about France?
Yes, indeed. Delighted to be with all of you today, and thank you for inviting me. What I'm going to do today maybe is to discuss a little bit France's relationship with China over the past few years. But, you know, as you know, the two countries have been together for a long time. France, you know, obviously established diplomatic relations in 1964, you know, diplomatically, they've had a long-standing relationship, working relationship through the United Nations in particular, through international organizations. You could say that even somewhat in Africa, the French and the Chinese cooperated at different times. There've also been some problems, which I will address, you know, from arms sales to Taiwan to you know, Tiananmen Square, France, you know, welcoming dissidents from Tiananmen Square in 1989. You know, various shifting policies of our presidents, especially President Sarkozy in 2010 over Tibet, over the Olympics, when the president at the time said he might go or he might not go to the the Beijing Olympics, you know, inauguration and things like that, which China doesn't like. So China sees France as a close ally and has seen it for you know, as a sort of a good partner. At the same time, you know, there've been a number of issues which were, of course, the Chinese always seem disappointed and always seem to punish France perhaps more because the expectations perhaps are higher. Strangely enough, there's, like in many of the countries that we are discussing today, there's a huge discrepancy between the elites and the general public. And I don't think the French general public has a very clear idea about China, about what China is doing, and you know, therefore, you know, I'll say, of course, a few words about COVID-19 situation in a moment, but this may be a game changer, as many of us have already discussed. Economically, of course, China and France are pretty close, not as close as, you know, Germany to China or China to Germany. But China is the 8th exporting country to France, with, you know, with only a sort of a small share of the market. But China is definitely, you know, a big importer to France, rather than the other way around. I mean, the French companies would, of course, be good at a number of industrial sectors, as well as food sector, luxury goods, and so on. But they've been long-term contracts, which is also part of the sort of state-to-state relationship between the two countries, in energy, transport, aviation. The French were there from the very beginning, even somewhat before the Germans. So it characterizes, you know, a deep, sort of long-standing relationship, but that is somewhat fading, and I'll come to that, because I think it's you know, economically, France obviously has been, as Lucrezia mentioned, one of the countries that led this movement, this effort to establish an FDI, foreign direct investment, screening mechanism at European level, alongside Germany and Italy. And that led to a screening and sort of EU-wide system that is going to be operational very soon. Now, of course, it's not compulsory, but France felt, you know, for many years now that the offensive from Chinese companies, both, I would say, state-owned and private companies, for about 10 years, has been hurting the French economy. Chinese companies purchased large pieces of land. They acquired a number of technology companies. They, of course, tried to, through Huawei and ZTE, try to play a role in the telecom, in the mobile telecom sector, quite successfully, I have to say, through at least two of the operators, SFR and Bouygues Telecom. Now, of course, 2017, that was also the year when Emmanuel Macron was elected president, and he started pretty well vis-a-vis China by, you know, sort of postponing his first visits till the beginning of the following year, and making a couple of pretty powerful speeches in China, especially about the Belt and Road Initiative, where he said, you know, publicly in Xi'an, in China, that you know, the Belt and Road shouldn't be a one-way road, and that, you know, China should understand the concept of reciprocity, which I think is really one of the big issues that all of us are trying to deal with, and that, you know, it's very difficult to discuss this issue with the Chinese. But anyway, talking about the COVID-19 situation, that we were still in that situation. Obviously, another game changer was the disinformation element of the debate, which there's nothing new, but of course, the past 6 months has seen a somewhat different attitude from the Chinese embassies, and I would say from the Chinese embassy to China, to France in particular. You had not just the Twitter accounts, which are new across the board, but also the embassy website attacking publicly the way France was handling the crisis, the COVID crisis management in terms of you know, the sanitary conditions and especially elderly care homes. And that was a very direct attack, you know, basically, you know, on a democracy and how a democracy should be handling the pandemic. And that led to the foreign minister to summon the Chinese ambassador to France, who was seen as a bit of a hardliner, Liu Xiaoye. He was in Canada before. So the Canadians somewhat were happy to see him go, but he landed in Paris. And then he started, you know, a very offensive, I would say, PR strategy. There are a number of problems now beyond this disinformation, which has become quite significant. First, I would say there's a military problem. France has a strong military component in the Indo-Pacific. In fact, it does have an Indo-Pacific strategy, like the United States, but slightly different because it, you know, we do have territories in the Pacific, but you know, we have ships cruising through the Taiwan Strait and the South China Sea, and China doesn't like that. There've been arms sales to Taiwan in the 1990s. Of course, France was punished for that. There was a French consulate closed and a number of contracts that France was barred from in China. But recently, of course, as we know, the Chinese Navy has been pushing back a number of foreign vessels, including American vessels, in the region because it's become more assertive. So France, as a sort of medium-sized nation, still wants to sort of continue this work, and there are very, very few European countries that do that. In fact, just one or two, the other one being the UK. But that's becoming a bit of an issue. There was a contract to Taiwan recently, and China was very unhappy with that. In terms of the French public opinion, how does that come about? Well, in fact, like many other nations, if you look at the Pew Research surveys, the favorability index to China is down 8% between 2018 and 2019. And if you look at the recent poll by the Tony Blair Institute, 60% of the French see China as a force for bad. I mean, that would be the Chinese government, of course, doesn't mean China as a country. And 44% of French people think the Chinese government is responsible for the severity of the COVID-19 crisis. Just one general comment, and I'll close because I'm conscious of time as well. I think, you know, the French elites have been shifting minds over the past few years. I've been sort of in and out of France for the past 25 years between the United States, China, and Europe and my own country. And I feel that the economic elites particularly are much less in agreement with a country that provides so much, you know, state unfair aid to Chinese companies, especially state-owned companies, but also private companies. And there's a real problem of market access in to Western companies. And many of the French business people now feel that China has become a very tough market. It's affecting the mood. And then, of course, the tourism issue. And of course, there's not going to be much of tourism this year. But, you know, we're talking about 2 to 3 million Chinese tourists. Italy has the same issue. Greece has the same issue. It's going to be a sort of a neutral year with virtually no Chinese tourists. But so far, you know, I would say Europeans in general do welcome Chinese tourists, but it's part of a general image, a little bit confusing, where people think Chinese people can bring economic benefits to France, but companies are not so sure now, and the government elites have been very subdued in their criticism. And I'm a little bit concerned with that, to tell you the truth. And I think it's a lot to do with the sort of Franco-German relationship and the fact that the two countries are somewhat competing for not just a share of the market, but a close relationship to China, to the PRC, which is of course very difficult because everybody is having difficulties. But I would leave you with this short comment. I'm happy to come back to that, but I feel, you know, especially with the German presidency of the EU starting this month, it's a very critical 6 months we're having now, and France doesn't want to be left on the side of the road, and therefore it is perhaps a little bit less critical on Hong Kong, on human rights than it should be.
Thank you very much, Philippe. Now we move a little bit eastward, and I would like to know from Plamen how Greece, whether Greece is changing its approach to China lately, and how, and if you can actually describe domestic roots of any change that you are looking at.
Thanks very much, Enrico. And let me tell you that I'm happy to be in the company of very good friends and colleagues. Let me briefly go back to history, I mean, to the story, how the Sino-Greek relations actually evolved over the past 15 years or so. Let me tell you that Greece is still marked. You can still see, you know, the marks of the decade-long economic slump in the country, which led to not just to a socio-economic crisis, but also to political crisis, and to a large extent, you know, determined the foreign policies of Greece over the past few years. Let me tell you that the crisis, which started back in 2010 as a fiscal one, and then evolved into a socio-economic and political crisis, and you remember all the debates about a possible Brexit, whether or not we should remain in the Eurozone and the EU. All these developments fed a very strong anti-European and anti-Western mood in Greece. And it is on the crest of this populist wave that we had a significant political change in Greece in 2015. In January 2015, we had a new government led by Alexis Tsipras, which was very anti-Western, anti-European in its psychological and political disposition. It was again against this background that China was seen as a possible alternative to much vilified Western partners. Particularly under the Tsipras government, between 2016 and 2019, China was seen as the savior of Greece and an ally against the West. Let me tell you that it was within that period, between 2016 and 2019, that Athens made some high-profile political goodwill gestures to Beijing. And of course, that raised very many eyebrows in the West. And that's when Greece was seen by many analysts and observers as China's Trojan horse in Europe. Let me quickly go through the list of the key goodwill political gestures made to Beijing by Athens back then, by the Tsipras government. In July 2016, there was the Hague ruling on the dispute between China and the Philippines. Remember their dispute over the South China Sea. The ruling was largely in favor of the Philippines, and yet Greece backed China. Now, this is not only a very visible gesture, which was commented on by many, but it's also totally inexplicable. And let me tell you why. Because the ruling of The Hague on the dispute in the South China Sea was based on provisions of the United Nations Convention on the Law of the Sea, the so-called UNCLOS. Greece has always been invoking UNCLOS in its standoff with next door Turkey, because we have similar disputes over the status of the Aegean, right? And yet, back then, in July 2016, Athens backed China in the case of a ruling which was based on UNCLOS. It is totally inexplicable. It was clearly a goodwill political gesture, possibly based on an expectation that China would back Greece against Western partners and Western creditors. A year later, in June 2017, Athens blocked an EU statement on human rights in China. That was in the United Nations Human Rights Council in Geneva. And of course, very many Western partners were really seriously upset after that. In August 2018, the Greek foreign minister signed an MOU on Greece's accession to the Belt and Road Initiative. Yet again, a very high-profile global political gesture. And you know how jumpy the Chinese are on getting people on board when it comes to the Belt and Road Initiative. In April 2019, Greece joined 16+1, you know, this platform for China-led cooperation in Central and Eastern Europe. And it's now become 17+1. Interestingly, and I've always argued that Greece has nothing to expect in return from its participation in 17+1. It has very close bilateral relations with China. But there are many reasons to believe that, in fact, Beijing asked Greece to join 16+1 at a time this format was losing traction. And, you know, it's become very controversial, and very many Central and Eastern European countries have become lukewarm to it. Now, exactly a year ago, on the 7th of July 2019, Greece had elections, and we've had a new government since, a right-of-center government, which has a very different approach to foreign policy and, of course, to Sino-Greek relations. It's trying to strike a very delicate balance between Greece's, you know, loyalty to Western alliances and Western partners, and at the same time, it is very much business-minded, very keen to attract foreign investment, and it's true that the Greek economy badly needs foreign investment. So the Mitsotakis government is trying, you know, to walk a tightrope in order to attract foreign investment, including Chinese investment, and then at the same time mend fences with the EU and particularly with the United States. Last October, Secretary of State Mike Pompeo was in Athens, and Greece and the United States signed, or rather upgraded, their pre-existing foreign defense cooperation agreement. And this is very important in the case of Greece because of geopolitics in the Eastern Mediterranean. I suppose we will be talking about tension with Turkey, Libya, and all that in our region. And of course, I've always argued that should there be an armed conflict in our neighborhood, China will sit out. It will never really get embroiled in a conflict. And Greece will always depend on its Western partners, the EU, France, the United States, and so on. Obviously there is a change of stance and change of mood when it comes to Sino-Greek relations. I would say not least because of new emerging priorities, and they're largely geopolitical. On 5G, because that's the talk of the town, for the time being, Greece since it's lagging behind in this race towards 5G, it has the luxury to sit on the fence and simply watch the debate in other key European countries, France, Germany, the UK. We are not yet ready to have a rollout of 5G networks, so for the time being, Greece is simply watching the show. But of course, I'm sure that the Greek government is taking note of the about-face of Boris Johnson in the UK and the shifting mood in both Germany and France. Let me tell you that a higher up in the Greek foreign minister, and I will not mention his name, recently said that if Greece were to choose to make a decision on 5G and whether the Chinese will be involved in their construction, in 5G, the construction of 5G networks, he came up with 3 criteria to be kept in mind by the Greek government. EU values, EU law, and national security. One final word. I think there's a very particular dimension in the Sino-Greek relations. It's a prominent one, but you cannot see it to the same extent in the relations between China and other European countries. Cultural diplomacy. Now, because Greece is very proud of its ancient civilization, and so are the Chinese, they are proud of their ancient civilization, this has been a very prominent leitmotif in the relations between Athens and Beijing. And it very often sounds with a lot of hype. It very often sounds like Greece and China are two long lost first cousins who are now enjoying their happy reunion several millennia after their first meeting. This has been a prominent theme because the Chinese have been banking on it, their argument being that since we are so close and we are both glorious civilizations, we should work together. So they're using cultural diplomacy as a tool to promote their economic agenda. I think I can, babble about this for hours on end. I'll stop at this, but I will simply highlight the importance of cultural diplomacy as a tool of economic statecraft in the case of China. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Plamen. Plamen, it's very interesting, and I guess Andrea has a question for you.
Yes. Sorry, I wanted to write in the chat, but I realized I was writing privately. Anyway, thank you everyone for the great presentations. My question regards all of you. So it seems to me that all the countries that we have talked about so far, so Greece, Italy, and France, they have all intense economic relations with China, though to different extents. So my question is, which domestic actors do you see in these countries that are pushing for, on the one hand, closer relations, and on the other hand, kind of putting some distance with China? So if you should say it's the diplomats against the business people, which actors would you mention first for these three countries? Thank you. It's a question for everyone, of course.
Okay, shall I start? Okay.
Yes, please.
Oh, very, very quickly. If you take France, you used to have a big discrepancy between the security and defense establishments and the others. Especially the foreign ministry, which has long been considered as pro-Beijing, as opposed to with a very tiny pro-Taiwan faction. I like to use the word faction when talking about China, Chinese politics. Then you had the economy ministry, which until maybe 2 or 3 years ago was also very pro-China, welcoming Chinese investments, encouraging trade, helping French companies to China, and things like that. Now I would say that the whole three ministries are China skeptic. So something has happened, and if I was the Chinese ambassador to France, which I will never be, I would be worried that I have no longer friends in high positions. And then I mentioned earlier in my presentation, the business sector. Again, very few people actually believe China is a country of opportunities. And when you read Chinese propaganda about the Chinese market, 1.4 billion people, the wonderful double-digit growth of the past 30 years, which is, of course, no longer since January of this year, people don't buy it anymore. And the debate has somewhat moved to Europe and moved to France, among others, about welcoming Chinese tourists, and maybe adapting the tourism sector to some of these tourists, which also is a subject for debating. And I think this debate is taking place in Italy as well, possibly in Greece, because it's not a simple one, and it's a civilizational debate about adapting hotels and cultural activities for Chinese tourists. But I would say again that the COVID, the pandemic that has been taking place, has not been in favor of closer ties to China, and top politicians. I mean, of course, we, like every Western country, we have a few proxies for China among politicians. I won't name them because they don't deserve it. But they are doing this job, thinking it will help China's case. But actually, the public opinion is shifting, and also the sort of the aggressiveness, maybe in the language. Also, the way I forgot to mention the Chinese diaspora in France, but that's a very important aspect. It's the largest Chinese diaspora in Europe, along with the UK and maybe Italy. But it's been here a long time, and also the affiliations of this diaspora vis-a-vis the embassy or vis-a-vis different groupings of Chinese organizations and so on. By the way, we've just had local elections, municipal elections, and as far as I can tell, most of the Chinese candidates failed and didn't do very well in this pool. So it's not that simple to come and say, well, I'm going to represent the Chinese diaspora in a local council. But actually, it didn't seem to have worked very well, over the past few months.
Excellent. Lucrezia?
Sure. Continuing on Italy, first I'd like to maybe put in perspective a bit the intense economic relationship, because especially for Italy, although I think it's true for other European countries as well, there's a tendency to make them perhaps bigger than they are. Like when it comes to Italy, I think if we just look at trade, China accounts for about 3% of Italy's total exports. I looked at this with a colleague of mine, an economist, earlier this year, and looking at trade data for 2018, more broadly for the European Union, we looked at the EU28, so still considering the UK. In 2018, and I wrote the numbers here, the Chinese market accounted for roughly 2.4% of the total exports for each of these countries individually, whereas the EU single market accounted for, on average, 66.1%. So that's just to put in perspective that, yes, obviously China is an interesting market, but at the same time, we need to put that the certain terms in perspective. Now, looking at the actors, I guess we can differentiate a bit between business, politics, security communities, and the public. And the public I referred to earlier in my input, looking at the polls and how things seem to be increasingly polarized. There is a general perception that China was helpful during the pandemic, but at the same time, China is also still seen as responsible, as much as in France, for causing this pandemic. So I refer specifically to a recent poll that was conducted by the Institute for International Affairs in Rome in collaboration with the University of Siena. And in this poll, 77% of respondents think that the medical supplies coming from China during the pandemic were a gesture of solidarity, which as I said earlier, only 10% was actually donations. Most of it was exports. But at the same time, roughly 70% also do think that China is to be blamed for the seriousness of the health crisis that we're all facing at the moment. So in a way, China was able to be received in more positive terms, but also, I think it wasn't quite able to really distract public opinion from China's own responsibility and mishandling and untransparency in its approach to tackle COVID-19. Business, which is something that I did not refer to earlier, something that's quite interesting is a paper published by Confindustria, so the largest Italian industry federation, in spring last year, which followed the BDI's own paper, BDI being the German industry federation, which is quite well known for first calling China a systemic competitor, which is the language that then was taken up by the European Commission. It's in its strategic outlook on China, talking about China as a systemic rival. Business Europe recently came out with its own paper, and I think summarizing the conclusions that Confindustria comes to, they are quite similar to the positions shared by Germany, Business Europe, and other countries. Whereas, yes, the Chinese market is considered interesting and important, but at the same time, if we want any substantial change and reciprocity, something that Philippe referred to, we need to push all together. That's what the Confindustria is saying, very similarly to the BDI and others, that no European countries alone can get anything from China, and especially the conversation about reciprocity, and now with the comprehensive agreement on investment, we know that that's very difficult. In politics, as I said earlier, it's the debate, the more critical debate on China has been led by the far right, so politicians from the League and the Brothers of Italy. Quite interestingly, considering that the League played a crucial role in getting to the signature of the BRI MOU, with Michele Geraci, a member of the League, playing the most important role in making this happen. But in a way, the League has rebranded itself as the transatlantic, the pro-US political party in Italy. So as they've taken this decision that they want to be perceived that way, Salvini has changed his approach. And as you all know, during the BRI MOU signature, he actually left Rome and wanted to be perceived as detached from it, despite having played a crucial role. But right now, I think in general, when we look at the ruling coalition rather than the opposition, the Five-Star Movement is certainly still the most open to China, the more China-friendly, including with recent statements about Hong Kong, and an interest in really taking up Chinese language of win-win cooperation, not interfering in China's internal affairs, whereas the Democratic Party has been putting more emphasis on the need to protect democratic values in relations with China, which is seen as a partner, an important one, especially economically. But so probably I would say there is no intention to antagonize China in the Democratic Party, but there is an intention to talk about values as well. And one key point about politics in Italy is the fact that China has become a topic really for internal debates, and it's become an instrument for political parties to use against each other effectively. So rather than being driven by genuine foreign policy considerations, is more of a tool in their hands. And finally, the security communities. I think there the awareness about China as a geopolitical actor naturally have always been more prominent. And one example that I'd like to mention is the fact that when Italy was signing the BRI MOU last year in March, around the same time, the Italian government was strengthening its golden power legislation. For example, to include 5G technology, both in terms of investment and supply from foreign countries, from foreign players, including them as part of effectively critical infrastructure that need to be scrutinized. So just to say that as Italy at this level, the top level with politicians was moving closer to China politically, the security communities and probably defense, interior ministries and others were also taking steps to try and make sure that Italian national security wouldn't be compromised. And I will leave it at that.
Thank you very much, Lucrezia. Before giving Plamen the possibility to answer Andrea's question, I would like to ask Brandon to jump in because he has a question from Plamen. So maybe Plamen can answer both.
Well, there were two questions. I had one, I'll ask Plamen my Plamen-related question, but I had a broader question for everyone. My question for Plamen was, I wanted to relate to Philippe's comment that the COVID-19 crisis is a game changer. And Plamen, to ask specifically what elites in Greek are thinking about in terms of the effect on the Greek economy and the tourist industry in particular as a result of the coronavirus crisis. It seems to me that this might cause Greece to look west rather than east, but I could be mistaken. And my broader question for everyone has to do with, I suppose, linking the internal politics to the larger global economy question, particularly in the wake of the COVID-19 crisis, which means the logic of the looking east was always the growth of the global economy and the benefits that it would prospectively bring Europe, Africa, and other regions. Given the decline of what we can see, or potential decline of global economic interdependence and the growing bellicose rhetoric that we're hearing both from the West, meaning the US and China, are we entering, or is there any sense in Europe that we're entering a particularly dangerous period?
Plamen.
Very good, very good. Thank you. I'll try to address all the three questions very briefly. Now to answer Andrea's question, yes, there are, I would say, 4 stakeholders in Greece in relation to China. First of all, the ship owners. Let me remind you that Greece has the biggest commercial fleet in the world. It's the biggest in terms of its value, not in terms of its size and volume. But it is the most expensive commercial fleet right now as we speak. Interestingly, it was ship owners who actually generated the idea, let's have the Chinese in Piraeus. Back in 2004 and possibly 2005, it was ship owners, specific ship owners, I will not mention the names, who approached the then Prime Minister Kostas Karamanlis, convinced him that we should bring the Chinese in and convince them to invest in Piraeus. In 2006, Karamanlis flew to Beijing on an official state visit. That's when Greece and China signed what became known as a comprehensive strategic partnership agreement. That's when they first talked about COSCO coming to Piraeus. And indeed, 2 years later, in 2008, COSCO won the bid for the concession agreement. That was the first agreement in Piraeus. And later on in 2016, COSCO took over the management of the entire facility. But it was the ship owners who were, the initiators of this investment project. And it makes a lot of sense because China is their biggest customer. You cannot change that. And it's perfectly understandable. Now, when it comes to political parties, it is quite clear that left-leaning parties or far-right parties, or I would say populist parties, seem to favor China more than centrists and moderate parties. About a year and a half ago, we carried out a large-scale media monitoring exercise, and we found out that between 2008 and 2018, it would be mostly left-leaning parties that would favor cooperation with China. When it comes to the general public, and I think I'm also answering Brandon's question here, there was a very interesting opinion poll carried out last April at the height of the lockdown. And according to the findings of that survey, 44% of respondents felt that China was responsible. China bore the responsibility for the outbreak and the spread of the coronavirus on a global scale. Now, if you ask me, I would say that this share could be even larger because if you keep an eye on the Greek social media, the mood is really toxic. It's very negative. People do not trust China. In that sense, I would say that the pandemic has been, among other things, a game changer in the overall attitude towards China at societal and political level. Now, to answer, the fourth stakeholder is the security community. I actually borrowed this idea from Lucrezia. Right now, a new national security strategy is being drafted. There's a talk of a National Security Council to be set up in Greece. And I know that the security community is under a lot of pressure, and they are seriously thinking about the implications of Chinese investment in strategically important infrastructure. And it's not just Piraeus, it's also the energy, the electricity, national electricity grid, it's also telecoms and all that. I mean, it's one of the issues on their agenda. Now, to answer Brandon's last question, I think that tourism, of course, it's a large industry in Greece to such an extent that Greece is actually falling victim, to its success in tourism because of the pandemic right now. And of course, the Chinese cannot travel to Greece at the moment. But on the other hand, the Chinese tourists there would be in the range of 200,000. They're not that many. We have a lot more German, French, and British tourists and Italian tourists rather than Chinese tourists. What is very interesting is what I call the golden visa rush. It's a bit like the gold rush, you know, in Alaska. Here in Greece, we have the golden visa rush because of this program of the Greek government in order to attract, you know, investment in real estate. Foreigners are allowed to get a 5-year Schengen visa, which is then renewable, if they pay a minimum of 250,000 euros, which, by the way, is a very low threshold. It's the lowest in the EU. Interestingly, 72% of all the holders of golden visas in Greece are Chinese citizens. It's not just impressive, I think it's daunting that the Chinese, that Greece is so popular with Chinese investors in property in Greece. To answer the other strand of Brandon's question, I would say that with the pandemic and the recovery fund, which is now being discussed in the EU, and the European Central Bank's QE program, which is also to be launched, I think that Greece has a lot to expect in terms of European resources. And they're infinitely bigger than whatever Chinese investment we may have in the overall, in the next years. So I think that the attention of the government over the years to come will be paid to European resources rather than Chinese investment. And the last question on globalization, I think that Greece has never been that much involved in globalization. It hasn't really been, of course, it's been benefiting from globalization, but not to the same extent that big economies like Germany, France, the United Kingdom, or China itself. Thank you.
Thank you, Plamen. Philippe.
Yes, thank you. Very interesting question from Brandon. Are we entering a dangerous period? I guess on the economic front, I think is the question. And to that, I would have a very mixed reply due to recent exchanges with business people. It's not that, you know, we can change the production lines from China to Romania or parts of Europe, of Western Europe tomorrow. Yes, of course, there will be, there's a reassessment, and everybody has been talking about that from the very beginning of this pandemic. But China is unique. China is unique as a production country, has unique factories. I mean, of course, the mass diplomacy, which is you know, of course, a term for propaganda rather than anything concrete. I mean, it's also an example of China reacting extremely quickly by manufacturing literally billions of masks in a matter of days or perhaps weeks at the most. There's no country in the world that can do that. And unfortunately, when you look at, you know, the situation of COVID-19 in many parts of the world, that could be potential alternatives to China, you know, in Latin America or in India, or, you know, and Africa. Africa may not be the most affected region by the pandemic, but there are many problems, and the situation is not improving. So therefore, from a European or French or Southern European point of view, and from multinationals' point of views, those that are using China as a manufacturing place will continue to do so until there's an alternative. You know, I've spent many years traveling across Asia, Southeast Asia, you know, in Vietnam, in the Philippines, and I've seen these countries growing and improving vastly. And Vietnam is a good example. I was there about a year ago. But you visit the capital city of Vietnam, Hanoi. It's not Shanghai. It's a different place, and the way people conduct themselves, it might be a very impressive people, and economically they've done very well. But I don't think they can do what China has done. So that would be my main point.
Excellent, Lucrezia.
Very similar to what Philippe just said in terms of those who manufacture in China who will continue to do so until there's an alternative. Just the other day, I was reading a quote, I think, in one of the Belt and Road tracking newsletters from an Italian shoemaker who was saying still the costs of Chinese labor are still very low, despite, as we all know, changes, including in the Chinese domestic setup. So there is no way that they could plan to get out of China anytime soon. So I think that debate is probably valid when it comes to strategic imports. We've seen it with masks and other kinds of medical equipment and PPEs during the pandemic. But otherwise, I think in Italy as elsewhere, the debate is going to be much more about possible supply chain diversification, but not necessarily a reshoring. Other than that, I think Sino-US tensions are very much discussed in Italy as a geopolitical issue. I mentioned in my input those issues that concretely are possibly impacted by this or have already been impacted, for example, space cooperation and other strategic issues like 5G and ports. But at the same time, when it comes, for example, to tech decoupling, it's still, to my mind, very unclear how this is going to unfold. I remember, I think last year, and then, well, again, actually this year, Huawei has been obviously on US entity list, including Huawei R&D centers. And these affected Huawei's, I think, first global R&D center in Milan last summer. And that has led Huawei itself to try and find ways around it to make sure that it could continue its activities. Similar, I think in spring this year, following increasing restrictions from the US, Huawei started a partnership with Italian and French ST Microelectrics for the production of chips for smartphones, car, electric vehicles, etc. But that's to speak about how Huawei might deal with it, but how these will impact Italian players, that I'm not sure. So in a way, yes, this topic is very much debated, but I'm still missing very clear answers.
Thank you for all the extremely interesting topics, and I have tons of follow-up questions, but I'll keep it to one question at the moment. So I think that there's something that all of you, I think, mentioned, the issue of foreign investment regulation mechanisms that in Europe are about to unfold. Now, my question has two parts. First, as we see that also here in Israel and many other countries, it's a kind of a catchword for engaging with the US. Look, we have a mechanism, so everything is okay. How effective do you see those mechanisms in, let's say, real life? And the second part of the question is, do you see various countries or the EU as a whole change the mechanism so that it has more, let's call it, more teeth in the COVID or post-COVID era? Thank you.
Who wants to begin?
I'm happy to kick it off unless Philippe's sure. So on the FDI screening mechanism, how effective that is. The one at the EU level is more of an information sharing mechanism. If I remember correctly, and Philippe and Plamen, please correct me if I'm wrong, member states do have the option of basically raising their hands if they are concerned about an investment in another European country. And I think if at least 3 member states raise those concerns, they can trigger an investigation by the European Commission. And the results of that investigation would not be mandatory because ultimately the decision is with the member states. It's a matter of national decision making and not the EU one. So yeah, in that sense, it's more of a info sharing and raising awareness raising kind of tool. Although we have seen, and this is already answering your second question about building an instrument that has more teeth, there have been calls by the EU itself during the pandemic to strengthen foreign investment screening in these times of economic vulnerability. So effectively guidelines from the EU asking all the member states to either speed up work to create those mechanisms, which are going to be mandatory starting from October 2020, and to possibly also lower the threshold for these type of screening, which is something that Italy, Germany, France did right away at the beginning of the pandemic. Briefly on the national investment screening, in the case of Italy, as I said before, it's a rather sophisticated instrument which has been strengthened multiple times to expand the definition of critical infrastructure to make sure that it covers dual use technologies, 5G and other new important developments. At the same time, as I said before, it's a political decision. So obviously there will be a table with all the relevant players from pretty much every ministry involved, together with the security communities. I assume that the political costs of not following through with a strong recommendation for using the screening framework would be high. At the same time, ultimately the decision is a political one, and is one with the president of the Council of Ministries, so the Prime Minister. So obviously political dynamics will have to be factored in these decisions which have to do with national security.
Excellent. Philippe.
Yes, sorry, I missed a few minutes earlier, but I would just say that when it comes to security and defense, France has a very strong, system in place, which of course is tied to the fact, what I was saying earlier about the security establishment being very China skeptic. Generally, I would say, there is concern about, especially Chinese investments taking place all over France in small towns and different sizes. But if you look at numbers, generally it's been down since 2016. I think MERICS and Rhodium have put out some figures that really show a decrease, significant for the past 3 years. We're back to numbers of 2012, I believe. So, there's no appetite for much Chinese investment at the moment, but there's no appetite from the Chinese side either, it appears, for different, domestic reasons. So therefore, the comprehensive agreement on investment is critical because it's, it's not moving anywhere. And one reason is because, China is also rethinking its relationship, its economic relationship with the rest of the world.
Plamen?
Right. I agree with Lucrezia that the investment screening regulation 452, that's the exact number, is not really restrictive or not really prescriptive. It does leave a large margin of flexibility. Of course, Brussels can issue what we call an avis, an opinion, which is to be heeded, considered by member states. But in the end, it's up to member states to decide whether or not they should proceed with a foreign investment. I think that, again, I agree with Lucrezia that ultimately this is a political decision. And I understand that in Israel, since Ori mentioned it, you have set up your own investment, I think you call it vetting panel, under pressure from the United States. And this is probably why the Sorek 2 desalination plant the contract was eventually awarded to an Israeli firm rather than the Hutchison Water, the Chinese company.
Yeah, there are different rumors on that, but I agree completely with what you're saying. It's a political tool.
It's a political decision in the end, isn't it? That's my point. Greece doesn't have an investment screening mechanism the way we mean it in Europe, and the way some 20 European member states already have investment screening mechanisms. But when it comes to, again, the political context, Greece is vulnerable to political pressure from Brussels and big EU member states, because it very much depends on the recovery fund and now the QE program of the European Central Bank. Prime Minister Mitsotakis has made it very clear that we're not going to receive any terms imposed on us, in the form of a memorandum. Memorandum is a dirty word in Greece. That's the word we used for 3 bailout agreements over the past decade. So in order not to have memorandum, MOU, or bailout terms imposed on Greece, I think that the Greek government will certainly pay attention to the avis, the opinions expressed by Brussels on controversial foreign investment.
Very interesting. So I have a comment, and I'll wrap up question for our 3 guests. The first comment comes from something Lucrezia mentioned when she was describing Italy 5G recent policies, and she stressed the word independence. I think that, in the end, if you look at the last year debate about China, we always tend to swing between voices or political parties that are looking at are being critical to China or being pro-China. But in the end, I think that overall this debate was a wake-up call for Europe. So to a certain extent was instrumental to sort of increase the maturity of the debate within each European country, especially at the crossroad of those 2 words that we are actually using as the title of our series, connectivity and security. For example, if you look at the debate on the Belt and Road in the first 4 or 5 years, from 2013 until the inscription of the Belt and Road in CCP Constitution in the 19th Party Congress, the main emphasis and reaction of European public opinion was connectivity and the need for connectivity. And then we started swinging and moving on the impact, the security impact of this connectivity. So, I mean, no matter if it's China related, I think this is overall as a positive effect. And if I may also say, actually, this is also a success for Chinese diplomacy, because as you know, the strengthening of independent forces in the so-called intermediate zone, Europe being part of those in the Mao Zedong diplomatic strategy, is perfectly fits with Chinese global strategy. This is my comment. Then the question is actually related to Europe, and I would like to know whether do you believe that European Union will be able to somehow create a resilient policy line that somehow differentiate for the decoupling, that is being proposed from Washington, but also somehow revise the whole logic of engagement? Do you see like a sort of, this is IR experts, they like to, play with words, like a sort of, should I say, more contained engagement, creative engagement? I mean, do you see Europe actually being able to come up with a sort of, resilient approach that somehow goes beyond probably the experience of the past, but doesn't like move bandwagon with American position? We start with Lucrezia, maybe.
All right, that's the $1 million question. Thinking of resilience, we will need political will again from the member states to come up with specific policies, and resilience is something that applies as a term to many policy areas, from resilience in terms of political pressure. Issues that came up during this discussion include disinformation, so issues of political interference. We talked a lot about investment, 5G, as to our resilience in terms of technology. So effectively, this could be applied to technological sovereignty, economic sovereignty, political sovereignty, and many other things. Whether Europe will be able to come up with such responses that are not just basically picking sides between the US and China, but coming up with something that is effective for Europe. I think we have taken quite a few steps over the past few years, and some of this have been led either by coalition of countries, France, Germany, Italy, now including with Poland, for example, thinking of the overhaul of a competition policy. And others have been put on the agenda by the EU. So the EU doesn't have foreign policy, strong foreign policy making powers, which are with the national capitals, but it has been able to put on the agenda issues of political influence, for example. And thinking of disinformation, a big priority of the von der Leyen Commission is actually the Democracy Action Plan, which specifically focuses on the collaboration with social media platforms to tackle the issue of disinformation, just to mention one. So ultimately, again, it will depend on the political will of different member states. In countries like the UK, obviously outside of the EU now, there seems to be increasing willingness to take on a more assertive and robust policy towards China. This might be the case as well for a growing number of European EU countries, maybe in the mid to long term, because also of COVID-19 and how China is generally perceived by European elites as having played a not very reliable role during the pandemic. In the short term, European countries' hands will be tied because we will be focused inwards and we will have a lot of problems to deal with. So I think the scope of policy change will be perhaps limited, but maybe in our approach to China, we will be more, I guess we will have a more open-eyed approach, I hope. And I will conclude, I guess if I had to summarize what the approach could be going forward, you mentioned containment, engagement. I think a lot of what we do with China will need to move towards something that we could call smart engagement very simply. It's not a question of disengaging from China, which is impossible and unrealistic. It's a question of revising the terms of our relationship and making sure that they happen on European terms. We have plenty of dialogues with China openly in violations of the terms of those dialogues. If we think of legal affairs, human rights, media dialogues between China and some European countries and the EU itself, people-to-people dialogue. And a lot of these initiatives could simply be revised. A lot of this will also come down to European countries realizing that they have potential to use their economic power as leverage vis-a-vis China. The EU is China's largest trading partner. A Magnitsky Act on human rights is on the table since December 2019, but it's not moving forward, despite the fact that the UK is moving forward with this now. So ultimately, it will come down to member states' willingness to realize that we are not that dependent as we think we are, that we have power in our hands and we can use it to leverage when it comes especially to issues that have to do with rule of law and democracy.
Philippe.
Thank you. I think to Lucrezia's smart engagement, I will offer sharp engagement. And I think, you know, and certainly not soft, by the way. Time has come for more, you know, perhaps hard power as well from Europe, but that's a general comment, you know, that France has been pushing forward for a long time. And in a way, you know, dealing with Xi Jinping's China, you know, it's all very well to use Chinese language such as win-win and you know, cooperation. But I think, you know, China doesn't respond well to weakness. It's unfortunate, but people to people, yes, of course, on principle, everybody wants people to people. Everybody wants to have cultural exchanges and things like that. But, you know, are they genuine, balanced cultural exchanges? The ancient civilization summit that takes place in Athens, as Plamen said earlier. Yes, it's all very well, but frankly, are there actual ties between China's civilization and Greek civilization, despite the fact they are both ancient civilization. Yes, sure, we can have debates and conferences and so on, but the heart of the matter is that it's a lot about economics, and it's a lot about morals and ideologies. And Europe's ideology is about values. It's all written down. It's about human rights. It's about basic principles, and none of those are actually defended by the current Chinese regime. And I think a good example of that is Hong Kong, really. I mean, we have a situation where an EU member at the time in 1984 signed with the People's Republic of China, which is still the People's Republic of China, and it's still the same government, unlike the UK, which is now out of the EU. They signed the Sino-British Declaration for the future of Hong Kong, granting Hong Kong 50 years of autonomous status. And the fact that Europe is somewhat struggling to put together a common position on this, to me, is outrageous. This is really something that we need to push, because after all, it's an international treaty. And in fact, going back to what I was saying at the beginning about public opinion shifting, I think a number of people on the streets who are not geopolitical experts might say, look, there's an international treaty and China is not standing by it. How come? This is going to affect China's image very badly. But of course, they're not going to give up, because Hong Kong is part of the Chinese territory. At the same time, international treaties, that is exactly in the EU's ADN, and this is something that we need to try to unite on. And again, sharp engagement is about putting things clearly on the table. And of course, I think people also want to continue the discussion. They don't want to close the door to China, even though it's very difficult. At the same time, the current regime in Beijing doesn't respond well to softness. And we've seen that with the trade war between the US and China. And we've noticed that the Americans, they don't just say things, they actually implement them. And we need to think about that as well. And it doesn't mean we're not going to work with the Chinese, but we need to be much stronger and not to be seen as a soft spot.
Thank you, Philippe. Plamen, sorry, I apologize. As you are giving us like the closing answer, I would like to add like a small attachment related to the Eastern Mediterranean. It's a very important issue. You mentioned before the decision, Greece supporting the decision, actually supporting China and the South China Sea issue vis-a-vis Philippines. And this is a very important topic, and also regards several other Arab countries, the Doha Declaration, and a very strong position taken by Greece in terms of revision of global governance norms. So most recently, the Eastern Mediterranean, together with the South China Sea, is becoming like the hotspot of in the international system. So my question for you is, do you see any which kind of role China has in the Eastern Mediterranean from a Greek perspective, and whether you see in the latest exclusive economic zone created by Turkey and Libya a China component as a sort of an attempt to control Sino-Greek traffic between Suez and Piraeus?
Right. Well, now that I've been assigned the task of delivering the grande finale of this session, let me tell you, first of all, to go back to the initial question, Enrico, that you're absolutely right that we have this conspicuous shift from the debate on connectivity to the debate on security. It is true. Several years ago, at least back in 2013, when the BRI was launched by Xi Jinping, there was this wave of enthusiasm about connectivity across Eurasia and Africa, and why not on a global scale? But right now, I would say that we have reached a very different point, and we talk a lot more about the security of connectivity rather than connectivity itself. I would say that one of the reasons is that the Belt and Road Initiative itself has become controversial. And we know that all this lofty rhetoric about win-win, cooperation proposed by the Chinese has become trite, hackneyed, and sometimes even ludicrous. I think that one will have to look at the split of benefits proposed by the Chinese. To pick the Piraeus example, I've been lobbying the Greek government, Greek authorities, to carry out an in-depth evaluation of the split of benefits to be drawn by the Piraeus through the Piraeus project. And I'm sure that the findings will be very interesting and perhaps even very disappointing for the Greek side. It's a common secret that the Chinese always make sure that they have the lion's pie, of the benefits in most of the BRI projects. I think the BRI has become controversial because the Chinese promote it too much, and they tout it as a painkiller. Each time you have a problem, they suggest, okay, we have the BRI. You have a conflict, we have the BRI. You have an economic predicament, we can offer the BRI. Let me tell you, since we have the Israeli friends and colleagues involved in this discussion, one of the four big conflicts in the Eastern Mediterranean has always been the conflict between Israelis and Palestinians. China, being a permanent member of the Security Council of the United Nations, has come up since 2015, I believe, with this 4-point proposal, okay? And I'd be very much intrigued to hear what Ori and Brandon think about China's proposal. Do you really think this is a realistic proposal? Do you think that the BRI will help Israelis and Palestinians live in harmony and a sense of brotherhood, for the rest of, through eternity? I don't think so, but let me see what Ori and Brandon think. There are real living conflicts like the ones in Libya, Syria. There are frozen conflicts like the one in Cyprus, and there may be emerging conflicts in the region, like tension building up between Greece and Turkey, and there may be a conflict around Cyprus because of the prospective gas reserves. And of course, there's the East Med gas pipeline that Greece, Cyprus, and Israel are involved in, and of course the United States also has stepped in favorably. So there are conflicts. Where is China in all this? It's a permanent member of the Security Council, but you can see that in all these conflicts, China has taken the back seat, which is probably understandable. It doesn't have a skin in the game. Let's be very blunt about this. But at the same time, there's a discrepancy between the lofty rhetoric of China and its inactive attitude to all these conflicts, all these flare-ups in the Eastern Mediterranean. Can China be a security provider and a security guarantor? The answer is no. In fact, China is a security consumer. China is enjoying its, business endeavors in the region, in Egypt, Turkey, you name it, Israel, Greece, Libya, and so on, by making use of the security umbrella provided by other actors. So there's a discrepancy there to be kept in mind. One final point on the broader question of decoupling. I don't think that decoupling is really feasible. I think that what we should be looking at, and of course, I'm also talking about the EU, about Europeans, we should be looking at diversification. The more diversified our sources and markets are, the greater the resilience that we all want to achieve. I'll stop at this, and thanks very much.
Thank you so much, Plamen. Thank you all for being with us today. It was a very stimulating and interesting question. As you know, we are going to have basically one webinar for each day of this week, and plus one more on next Monday, so you're welcome to join and participate in our debate. And at the end of July, we are going to wrap up the conclusion of all these webinars in the analytical report. And so we will be happy to share it with you and also collect your comments. Thank you very much again, and have a good week.
Thank you.
Thank you.